You can't have a naval warfare without ships, and you can't have tank warfare without tanks. Well, Christians can't conduct culture warfare unless we have a culture.
Just in the last 5 to 10 years, we've seen this is happening in almost every Christian community across North America. They're losing their kids because their kids are being exposed to stuff online.
One of the protections against schlock and against degrading literature and degrading entertainment is exposure, thoroughgoing exposure to the good stuff.
Welcome back to the Bridgehead. My name is Jonathon Van Maren, and today we're going to be talking to Pastor Douglas Wilson of Christ Church in Moscow, Idaho. He is the author of scores of books. He is a social and a political commentator, and we're going to be talking about his insights into building anti-fragile Christian communities in an anti-Christian age. As someone who has lived in and worked on one of these communities for many years, he has many insights that are important for people to listen to. This is that conversation. Well, thanks so much for taking the time to talk to us.
Happy to do it.
So to start off, I wanted to ask a bit about the origins of your community in Moscow, Idaho, because one of the most interesting discussions going on right now in Christian communities, not only across the U.S., but across the West, is how do we prepare for the post-Christian age and the anti-Christian age? And this has attracted a lot of attention to the project that you've been working on in Moscow for a very long time, because it seems like you guys have the answers to a lot of questions people are asking. So maybe give us the origin of your community.
Sure thing. Moscow, Idaho is a small town, about 22,000 people in the panhandle of Idaho. It's a university town. So small town in a very conservative state with a state university making it a much more liberal town than the rest of the state. So that's the scenario. A number of years ago, back in the 1960s, my father wrote a book called Principles of War. And he was a Naval Academy graduate and had studied at the Naval War College. And what he did is he took the principles of war, Clausewitz, Sun Tzu, that kind of thing, principles being things like mobility, surprise, concentration, and he applied them to spiritual warfare. So it's been an underground classic for years, still in print. It's a great book. I've read it a number of times. And one of the things that fell out of this study was the idea of the decisive point. In military affairs, a decisive point is a target that is simultaneously strategic and feasible. It matters to the enemy if you take it. It's strategic. It is possible to take.
Right.
Feasible. Right. So New York City is strategic, but not feasible. If we took New York for Jesus, it'd be all over. But it's not feasible. And if there's a little town down the road from us, Beauville, Idaho, that's just a bend in the road, that's feasible. We could take it in a weekend. But it's not strategic. When it was all done, all we'd have is Beauville. My father decided back in the 60s that in North America at least, the decisive points were major universities in small towns. The major university made it important, and the small town made it feasible. So that was his idea. Where could we go to conduct evangelistic outreach that would give us the biggest bang for the buck? He then discovered that Moscow, Idaho, and Pullman, Washington, are two small towns, 8 miles apart, with a major university in each one. University of Idaho is here in Moscow, and Washington State University is in Pullman. So he moved here. He moved here in 1971. I helped them move. I just graduated from high school. I helped them move here, was here for a few months. Then I went in the Navy. And I got out of the Navy in 1975 and wound up joining with the ministry here. And all of the ministries here, Canon Press, New St. Andrews College, Logos School, a network of churches, are all downstream from my father's decision to do that. And It's quite a flourishing community of Christians here. But one of the things to note is that it's having a big outsized impact. In other words, the impact of the ministries here is a lot bigger than what we actually are. And that, I think, has to do at least somewhat with the fact that this is a decisive point.
So to give people kind of a snapshot in Moscow, Idaho, and the surrounding area, you've got several churches now. You have New St. Andrews, which is a college. You have a seminary there. You have both a homeschooling operation as well as a private classical Christian school. There's a lot of the local economy, of course, is participated in by Christians who go right. to these institutions, which makes them anti-fragile, as Aaron Wren would put it. Now, what's interesting also is if you look at when this community started in the 1960s, 1970s, right? In the 1980s in the U.S., you kind of have the great conservative backlash, and things really do look for this brief moment like it's morning in America. President Ronald Reagan writes a book about abortion, and the Human Life Amendment is supported by the GOP at the time. Phyllis Schlafly and her army of housewives sort of single-handedly defeat the ERA up against 3 presidents and most of the mainstream politicians. And then the Clinton administration in the early 90s kind of ends a lot of that optimism for the religious right that actually was pretty successful during that period. How has the strategy evolved as the expectation of the cultural hostility changed? Because if you look at how Christians were thinking in the 1980s and then in the 1990s, and then we'll get to this, but how they see America now are radically different. Has the strategy changed or evolved at all?
Well, ours has, because theirs has. When the moral majority era, the Reagan era, the 80s, when conservatives flexed, one of the things that happened was the Democratic Party. You saw this as early as Jimmy Carter. Jimmy Carter was a Democratic president. Bill Clinton was a Democratic president. But Clinton was a shrewd enough retail politician to act conservative on a number of things. Jimmy Carter did the same thing with being a born-again Christian, and that sort of that kind of thing, both with that wing of the party, basically snookered a lot of Christians, where they just let their guard down. Maybe it's not so bad as all that. We can all be together now. Now we're looking at the Harris-Walz ticket, which is basically Bolshevik and a Menshevik running for president, the most radical left wing out there, out on the skinny branches stuff. And if you had told the Christians back in the 80s that this is what was going to be coming down the pike, I think they would have been astonished. We thought that the liberalism of the Democratic Party back then was really bad, and so it's gotten to the point where people have been desensitized. Christians have been desensitized to this kind of thing by the rot that has pervaded the entertainment industry. The fact that probably the principal offender, I would say, is the government schools and all the millions of Christians who have not yet gotten their kids out of the government schools. There's a character in one of Hemingway's books who was asked how he went bankrupt. And the answer is first gradually and then suddenly. And that's what I think has happened over the 80s, 90s, gradually, and then the last 5 years, suddenly.
So what's really interesting, though, about the way things have evolved and why I think that you've become such a big part of this discussion is if you look at the 1980s and even the 1990s to a degree, there was this idea that you need to fight the culture wars, which means you need to sort of retake Hollywood, you need to retake the Ivy League. There's all these different institutions that you need to retake, and people put an enormous amount of effort into doing so. And during this entire period, even when liberalism was pretty pretty limp-wristed compared to the kind of stuff that we see now. You were building parallel institutions in Moscow,
right.
Replacement institutions, to kind of use Charles Taylor's phrase. You were opting out of the mainstream social imaginary and creating your own social imaginary that would allow a community to survive, even if those institutions were never taken. And I find this interesting because you're very often characterized by anybody who writes about you as a culture warrior. Whereas I think one of the interesting tactical decisions that you guys seem to have made is that actually there's a lot of culture wars that aren't worth fighting. Those places have been lost. They're owned by the culture. We're actually creating our own culture. And so looking at what a lot of people are trying to figure out, how do you start going about creating a subculture that has not only its own educational system, but also creates its own art, creates its own novels, creates its own books, creates its own documentaries, these sorts of things, because that seems to be one of the magic ingredients that a lot of people are attracted to.
Yeah, that's a very good question, and it goes right to the heart of everything. Thank you for it. So the moribund establishment, Hollywood or New York publishing, the New York publishing world, are overgrown, out of shape. They're diseased, but they do know how to do a few things well. And one of the things they know how to do is defend themselves against frontal assaults, right? So their walls are tall and thick, and the gates are massive. And if you want to attack Disney, good luck. There was an attempt to boycott Disney a few decades ago that just came to nothing. One of the things that I'm a boomer. I was born in 1953. When we were first married, I knew that I wanted to make a dent. I wanted to be involved in all of this. And we wanted to bring up our kids in Moscow because it's a great little community, a great place to bring up kids. And our initial idea was that we'd bring up our kids here, and then I would move back to the East Coast to try to get engaged in what was going on. And one of the things that occurred to me in the mid-'80s, and this is probably when the penny dropped for me, is the whole desktop revolution came in during that time. And I started messing around with computers because when I first started writing political commentary, it was in 1980. At that time, there were two computers in our town. One was up at the university, a mainframe computer, and the other was down at the newspaper. And I went down to the newspaper weekly to type in my column there. Well, when desktop computers started to become a thing, I realized that it was going to be possible to make a dent from where we were. All the things I wanted to do back on the East Coast were going to be possible to do from this small town that I loved living in. I love it here, and so we started publishing a magazine in 1988, Credenda Agenda. We started publishing books. Canon Press started in 1988. In the immediate aftermath of this realization, not only did the technology exist to write, format, print books, that the technology was overtaking, and also for jumping ahead to things like movies and whatnot, technology was making high quality cameras available without having to spend $300,000 and living in Hollywood in order to afford one. And so a corollary to the just the physical practicality of making stuff, a corollary to it had to do with the gatekeepers. All right. Back when publishing was controlled by the New York houses, back when movies were controlled by Hollywood, you had to know somebody, you had to sell your soul to somebody, you had to sneevel your way past the gatekeepers in some way, and that's how they defended their their worldview hegemony, right? They just had a chokehold on everything. Well, then, so this stuff started to happen, and then the internet happened, and then blogging happened, and and the end result of this was the gatekeepers were scattered in every direction. And now, obviously, there will always be some form of gatekeeping, but what happened was the gatekeeping apparatus was radically decentralized, and the whole thing thrown into a Wild West situation. And I began blogging in 2004, and I thought, this is quite striking because we had established a magazine in 1988. But the turnaround time, let's say a hot issue hit, some controversy, we could write on it. We had our own ability to publish. We do all that. So we would write, edit, do all these things. And the turnaround time was a couple of months. We could get a magazine out in a couple of months. Today, if something like that happens, I can get a blog post out later in the day. The turnaround time is nothing compared to what it was. And I don't have to check with the boss man at the top of the skyscraper about whether or not to do this. Now, we're all sinners and we all need accountability, but this accountability for us now is radically decentralized. And here in this small town, I'm answerable. I'm a pastor. I answer to the elders of my church for what I preach. But at the same time, it has been remarkably liberating. And so consequently, as we have been putting out sort of the steady drumbeat of content, it has over time had a cumulative effect, letting people know about what's going on here, able to communicate.
So one of the things that I think is really relevant to the conversation about what church communities should do in the anti-Christian age, as we move from the post-Christian age into the anti-Christian age, is kind of harking back to a lot of our traditions. And Dr. Andrew Walker's done some good work on this, I think, in looking at the natural law tradition and things that Protestants have largely forgotten about. What I find interesting about a lot of the culture building work in Moscow is that it does seem to, and I don't know if this is self-conscious, you'll tell me, focus on the Christian transcendentals of goodness, truth, and beauty. Whereas a lot of the Protestant communities will emphasize one to the detriment of the other. So some Protestant communities won't find beauty to be important at all. They'll actually think it's kind of a Catholic thing. Our churches can look like strip malls or huge barns. Cathedrals aren't necessarily important at all. We're sort of suspicious of most art forms due to the extent to which art has been corrupted and the extent to which art has been one of the most potent tools of the sexual revolutionaries for transforming our culture. And that produces in us a suspicion of art as such, as opposed to a suspicion of the way that this vehicle has been used. So beauty, I think, is probably the most neglected of the three Christian transcendentals and Protestant churches in particular. But then you have other churches, you'll have Episcopalians or Anglicans who still have a beautiful cathedral, but they've given up entirely on truth and they've redefined goodness. And when you look at sort of the broad landscape of Protestantism, you kind of see that there are very few that are at least self-consciously attempting to encapsulate all three, and that wherever you see one most prominently displayed, they're kind of shorting on the other. Have you tried to self-consciously look at these three transcendentals and address this? And do you find this to be a helpful framework to look at the mission of Christian institutions?
It's not only a helpful framework, I regard it as an essential framework, and it has been self-consciously pursued early on. I've said this many times, and we'll say it again here to you. I've made the point that you can't have a naval warfare without ships, and you can't have tank warfare without tanks. Well, Christians can't conduct culture warfare unless we have a culture, right? What's happening in a lot of times when it just reduces to sheer politics, it's an ideological conflict, not a cultural conflict. and that's why it can collapse so easily, right? A political party can go poof one day, and it's not there anymore. Cultures last for centuries because it has to do with language and customs and architecture and songs. So if we want to have a culture warfare, if we want to defend the Christian faith in a cultural context, we have to have a cultural context from which to conduct that warfare. Chesterton once said that you want the kind of man who fights not because he hates what's in front of him, but because he loves what's behind him. And this is really it's really important. So this is why we've been diligently trying to cultivate real community. So real community, and that's probably when we've had hundreds of people move here to Moscow, which has accelerated in the last few years. But one of the words that I hear more than any other word in this regard is the word community. Okay, and I'm not talking about the coffee and donuts community hour, not the hour of community after church. I'm talking about living with your people, borrow your neighbor's lawnmower community, have your kids growing up in the same school taught by Christian teachers community, where the community is thick. And where community is thick, it creates deep and profound bonds. And I've joked that in another decade or two, we're going to have a deacon on staff whose sole job is to tell people who can marry whom. We don't want to become inbred. No, don't flirt with her. So because what's happening is there's a lot of weaving that's going, and it's a tight weave, because it encompasses everything.
So the family trees are in danger of merging into a hedge, is what you're saying.
Yeah. And but all of this is going to translate into, we want an architectural expression. We're just finishing up a church hall now. We want musical expression. We've got music camp. We want all the kids in the community to be able to sight read music and to be musically literate the same way we want them to be literate with ordinary language. We want to teach them all to read. We want to have them to know and understand what good music is. We want them to know and understand what good literature is. Not only do we want them to be able to appreciate it like critics, we want to create the kind of topsoil that starts producing and growing things of our own contribution to that.
Yeah, so let's talk about that for a minute, because I think that most people would instinctively agree with you. To fight a culture war, you need to have a culture. And there's a couple of different ways of approaching this, of course, right? Anthony Eslin refers to like the classics as the great unused artillery of the culture war. But what you said there about literacy is important, because if you read Mark Bauerlein's book, The Dumbest Generation and the Dumbest Generation Revisited, he says that, he's got university students who aren't capable of reading Dickens. I've talked to a lot of high school teachers who say it's very difficult to get kids interested in books like Laura Ingalls Wilder's Little House on the Prairie, because they're bored by the pace. They're bored by what happens, because their brain is structured by the internet as opposed to structured by steeping in genuine culture. And so when we're looking at culture, there's two aspects. There's recovering this inheritance that's still there. We just have to pick it back up. All these classics still exist. Some of the greatest books ever written, like Christian realism, as I think encapsulated in Sigrid Undset's work. This stuff is magnificent. That was one of Carl Trueman's recommendations. And a lot of the books that I believe you're republishing with Canon Press, like the book Heidi. Joanna Spiri, the author of Heidi, was a member of the Swiss Reformed Church. Her grandfather was a pastor of the Swiss Reformed Church. That book was written for adults as a story of the prodigal son returning home, the alm uncle realizing that he needs to return to church. And for kids, it's the story of a little girl saying her prayers and playing out on the mountainside with Peter and the goats. So this is all still there, and it's just as good as it ever was. On the other hand, you have this idea. The idea of creating a self-consciously Christian culture also comes with a lot of its own pitfalls, because would you consider, for example, 473 Amish romance novels the kind of Christian culture that you're referring to, or would you be referring to something else?
I'd be referring to something else. Although, let me say something. Let me say something in the mildest possible defense of the Amish romance novels. We sometimes, when we look at high culture, like the cathedrals of the Middle Ages, or the great works of literature, or the poetry, Dante, and when we look at those, what we're doing is we are looking at the best that generation produced.
Yeah,
it's the best, and then we turn around and look at our culture, and we see all this schlock, right? Well, that's because the schlock is contemporary and hasn't disappeared yet. It hasn't died yet, right? So 300 years from now, somebody's going to say, to have lived in the 20th century, the 20th and 21st century, Tolkien and Chesterton and Lewis, giants walked the earth in those days, because nobody is going to be even aware of our Amish romance novels at that time, because they will all have died the death. Right. In order to have good Major League Baseball, you have to have Little League everywhere.
Right.
And some of the Little League players, let us speak frankly, aren't that good. And when you have a lot of people trying to be writers, you're going to have quite a bit of really bad stuff, bad enough to make your teeth ache. At the same time, I like the fact that there are people out there trying to write, because that means the cream can rise. And I believe that if someone says, "Hey, we've got our ratio of schlock to cream is not very good right now. We need to up the game," and establish colleges like New St. Andrews and teach the kids how to do it. That is necessary, but I don't want to despise the fact that people are at least trying.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because to a degree, there's stuff that's just too formulaic, right? People think that. One of my journalistic heroes, Ted Byfield, always said that I write as if Christianity were true. I don't actually have to explicitly proof text all the paragraphs in my news reporting. I write as if Christianity were true. And a lot of Christian artists would just produce art as if Christianity were true. That's the foundation they're sort of operating from. When it comes to creating your own subculture, creating a Christian culture, I guess it wouldn't even be a subculture, it's a separate culture. You're also very willing to use those, New York publishing houses, et cetera, when the opportunity presents itself. Because I know that in Moscow there are people who have gone to the Ivy League universities and are currently attending Ivy League universities. There's people who have published with publishing houses like Random House. So when you're looking at, okay, we need to create our own subculture and produce stuff, to what degree do you engage with the secular culture and still attempt to use their vehicle, as flawed as it is, to get to introduce your culture to the broader culture?
Yeah, when a door opens, you go through it, and the reason you go through it is because you want to you can establish credibility that way. So if you just let's say you've got all the technology I referred to earlier, and you just start your own press, which we did, Canon Press, and you start by publishing your own stuff, particularly fiction and whatnot, then one of the things you're going to have to fend off is the charge that it's a vanity press, that it's no good. You're just, the only way you could get published is to publish yourself, and so on. And so in this situation, my son has written for Random House, and his best-selling books for Random House. Has written for HarperCollins. My son-in-law has a book published with Oxford University Press, and what that does is it gives us credibility when we move on to publish our own stuff. Hey, look, it's not that you're doing this because you can't make it elsewhere, and it just simply diffuses that objection. At the same time, I wouldn't spend 15 or 20 years trying to break into the big time. It's more like, hey, the door opened. This would be strategically wise for us to go through it. But that's not where our energy and all our attention is focused.
So I'm interested in two questions that kind of emerge out of this discussion so far on both gatekeepers and how technology enables the creation of cultures that can punch above their weight regardless of where you live, whether it's a small town or a big town. Because obviously there's positives and there's negatives. And so if you look at the recovery of the Christian inheritance in literature and art and music, you also have to have people whose minds are formed to be able to recognize them and to enjoy them. And what we're seeing right now, I think, is that a lot of Christian subcultures right across the Western world that had kind of successfully put up very geographical walls between them and the mainstream Western culture are now realizing that their kids are merging with the secular social imaginary through TikTok, through social media, through the internet, because with the digital age, the positive is you can send your stuff out in the airwaves. The negative, of course, is that regardless of where you live, it doesn't matter so much in the other way either. And there's a lot of sexual evangelicals on TikTok, and there's a lot of people that are trying to get your kids hooked on porn on Instagram. There's a lot of areas now where you can reach other people, but they can reach your people as well. And if they do, they can not only induct you into their social imaginary, and suddenly your mind is shaped by the trends on TikTok or Instagram or social media, but they can also get you addicted to the now ubiquitous poison of pornography. And so how do you sort of straddle, how do you create a relationship with technology that is as beneficial as possible while minimizing all of the fallout? Because just in the last 5 to 10 years, we've seen this is happening in almost every Christian community across North America. They're losing their kids because their kids are being exposed to stuff online. I spoke at a Christian school a while ago where, a huge percentage of the high school, this is a conservative Christian school, the kids, thought it was rude not to use preferred pronouns. And, the teachers are sitting there kind of in shock. It's like, we've got our own institutions. But they've all got a smartphone. They've all got access to the internet. And so they've still been merged into the social imaginary because it almost exists digitally now. So how do you come up with a strategy to confront that?
All right. So one of the things you do, when my wife and I were bringing up our kids, we had to deal with pop culture, but not nearly at the levels that my kids have had to do bringing up my grandkids. One of the things my son said to his kids, the youngest is just entered high school, and the older have graduated college now. But he said to them once, "My gift to you is you not having a social media account." Right. So one of the things that we have to do is parents just need to be parents. You have to be current and on top of it. And if you can't be current and on top of it, then you need to ensure that your kids are not current and on top of it. So basically, mom and dad need to know what's going on, and they need to exercise judicious prudence. Logos School, the school that is here, the classical Christian school is here, has recently moved to put a real set of limits on phone use. We don't want to say anything that's technologically possible. Let's let the world tell us how to use it. There are also technologies developing that parents need to appropriate, where you have dumb phones that you like it, the fact that your kid who got left behind at volleyball practice can text home and say you like being connected that way, but you can take measures to make sure that those doors are locked, those doors and windows are locked, and that's a parental responsibility to do.
So When it comes to creating literacy, so would you say that literacy, in order to ensure that our kids can actually enjoy the Christian inheritance that we need to reclaim while also working on creating our own Christian culture, what are some of the educational steps that are necessary? Because right now, like the public school system doesn't form kids so much as it deforms them, and this is done very, very deliberately. And this has been one of the primary focuses of the Moscow Project as well.
Mm-hmm. So that issue comes back to education, classical Christian education. I like to tell a story about an anecdote of a young boy who was apprenticed to a jade master, and he went there to the first day, and the old man just handed the little boy a piece of jade and pottered around the shop and telling stories and reminiscing, didn't teach him anything. And the second day, the same thing happened. Third day, the same thing happened. He just walked around the shop all day, pointing things out and not really getting much of anything done. And the boy was thinking about talking to his father about dropping this useless apprenticeship. When on the end of the week, on Friday, he came in, he was handed a little rock, and first thing he said was, "That's not jade," right? What the master had been doing had him carrying around a piece of jade all week, just holding it in his hand all week. And then he handed him a counterfeit. And the first thing he said is, "That's no good. That's not it." One of the things that kids need to, one of the protections against schlock and against degrading literature and degrading entertainment is exposure, thoroughgoing exposure to the good stuff. So when kids can intelligently deal with Paradise Lost or Dante's Inferno or the Iliad and the Odyssey, and they've read Herodotus and they've read Thucydides, and they've got they're stocked. Their warehouses are stocked with good stuff. And then if you try to entice them with either Christian schlock or secular schlock, Twilight books, or if you say here's some really exciting stuff, they're going to say that's not jade.
Right. So looking again kind of at the gatekeepers, which you mentioned earlier, and I'd wanted to get into this because it's really interesting. We're in a very interesting moment right now where I think Christians are increasingly coming to the realization that we're in this weird civilizational pregnant widow moment where the old world has died and we do not yet know what the new world is going to look like. We just know that it's over, that there's no coming back from a lot of the things that we've done. And this has made a lot of people go very squirrely. This has made a lot of people, follow after all kinds of strange ideologies. And one of the things that I've noticed in Protestant circles and then Reformed circles more specifically over the last 3 to 4 years, which I'd never seen before, especially at this volume, is the rise of this weird anti-Semitic strain in Reformed communities. And I say it's weird because I write for a number of publications on this stuff, and I wrote about the alt-right through the sort of resurgence in 2015 all the way to their more or less collapse in 2017, 2018. Predominantly, it had been a very specific sort of self-identified Catholic that was susceptible to this kind of stuff for all kinds of historical reasons, but I hadn't seen it to nearly the same degree here. Now, if I look at the comments under your stuff on Twitter and 5 or 6 other people who write on these subjects, it's just sort of like anti-Semitism all the way down. It's kind of people playing the let's see how many Jews we can identify in this thing game. It's people kind of finding the dumbest thing Martin Luther ever wrote and selectively quoting it for everybody. So when you look at this, this is obviously something that we do need to police. As you mentioned, there have to be gatekeepers. So how do we deal with, for example, this resurgence of anti-Semitism, especially when in a community like yours, people are attracted to this sort of very self-conscious aura of defiance, of building its own culture. So these kinds of people are going to be attracted to your kind of community and are going to want to try and hijack it with their own poisonous ideology and to infiltrate it. So how do we start to deal with that kind of thing?
All right. So there's two things here. One, I'll just point out the basic logical mistake that's being made, and that is we have cultivated a culture of defiance of secularism. We don't want to do it that way. We don't want to play by your rules, and people are attracted to that. But it's easy to make the logical mistake of affirming the consequent. And affirming the consequent is if I study hard, then I'll get good grades. I got a good grade. I must have studied hard. Well, no, you bribed the teacher, or you were lucky, or it doesn't. If A, then B, therefore A doesn't follow. So just because you're ticking off a liberal doesn't make you faithful, right? So some people have said, okay, we're gonna own the libs. We're gonna make the libs cry, and we've discovered that anti-Semitism does that. Well, with a certain kind of lib, the Democratic Party is becoming a cesspool of anti-Semitism as well. But that's one thing, is affirming the consequent. It's a logical mistake. But the deeper question is, what's driving it? Because I think we have to think comprehensively about it. And I think that one of the things I'm picking up on is that this is part of a network of difficulties. I would describe it as, if I'm looking at this phenomenon, I'm identifying, one, bitterness toward boomers, right? Hostility toward Jews, and contempt toward third worlders. Okay, does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So I think that there's a lot of boomer fathers who disappointed and aggravated and let down their sons and the next generation. And that generation has been profoundly discombobulated by the lack of godly fathering, right? And then some of these people are products of the public school system. They react to it. They red pill to it. And then there's this underlying angst. Why did my boomer pastor, why did my boomer father, why did this previous generation let this happen to me? I don't have an inheritance. Why don't I have a cultural inheritance? Now, as a basic question, that's a very good question. Mm-hmm. But bitterness blinds you to the answer. So what happens is, I think the root of this is, quite frankly, I think the root of this is fatherlessness or father hunger. And that bitterness has driven people to look for a scapegoat. And historically speaking, the Jews are always available for that, right? And part of the reason for the scapegoating vulnerability is, as I've argued in my book, American Milk and Honey, the Jews are a high-performing people. They have dads that expect certain things of them. They have, this is what you're going to be: a doctor, a lawyer, or a banker, son. And there's a cultural lineage and heritage. And of course, being a high-performance people, when it goes dark, when it goes bad, it goes bad in a spectacular way. And you've got a high percentage of Jews who are Bolsheviks also, making a mess, right? So a person who has not received that kind of inheritance from his people, from his father and grandfather, it's easy to scapegoat the Jews over that. And then it's also easy to look around, because nobody wants to feel like an inferior schlub. It's easy to look around and find someone, someone crossing the Mexican border that you can look down on. Now, I do think, I'm not saying that because I think that the situation on the border is good. I think it's a chaotic mess, and we need to secure the border. And I'm all about securing the border. But I'm talking about the keenest contempt that I see rising up, sort of pride in your whiteness. Well, I think it ought to be gratitude for your culture, not pride in your whiteness. But a lot of these guys were robbed of their culture.
Right.
Right. And so what do they have? So on the one hand, some of these guys are just malicious, bad actors. Some of them are, I would describe as sort of an army of 12-year-old orphan soldiers. They've been abandoned, and they're being captained by 14-year-olds, and they're shooting in the right direction overall. But there's there is a toxic disease component in there that is not their friend.
So how do you gatekeep for that then, right? Because if you have a generation of people where institutional trust is completely broken for a whole bunch of very obvious and very sane reasons. Right. There are no, just this election cycle alone has given us enough evidence to write off the honesty of the institutions. But then you have how do you in a community like yours take the kinds of people who are introducing this disease, as you put it, and isolate it and cut it back out so that the infection doesn't spread? Because you do have amongst conservative Christian people a fertile ground right now for this sort of thing, because the only thing we know for sure is that it's insane to believe what the institutions have been telling us. And you can very quickly take that way too far, right? Yep. Smashing things that deserve to be smashed can turn into iconoclasm so quickly you don't even notice over the sound of all the smashing. And you can head too far in that direction. And so when you've got communities that are fertile ground to be said, like when somebody says, hey, they've been lying to you this whole time, the institutions, we're like, for sure. And then it's like, okay, and it was these people doing it, or all of these ideas. And I've seen these conversations unfold online. I've watched people fall down, the rabbit hole. And so how do you, from a practical sense, ensure this kind of thing doesn't spread in a community that is a very ripe ground for those kinds of people?
Yeah, because we've already granted the major premise. Yeah, they've been lying their heads off.
Yeah. The institutions
the institutions have utterly discredited themselves. And then someone says, and the institution told me that the world was round. Yep. Or the institution told me that we landed on the moon, or and down the wormhole we go. The thing that I resort to, and I think this is not meant as a Jesus juke, but the thing that I resort to is this: I believe that the only thing that can bring fragmented, sinful, fallen human beings together in the way that they ought to be together is gospel. So consequently, in the community, I should have mentioned this before, in the community that we are building here, worship is central. So the image I use is, picture a medieval town with a cathedral at the center and a city wall going around the whole town. And I regard the cathedral is the church, the town is the kingdom. All right, the church is sort of gives definition and structure and cohesion to the kingdom, but the church is the place where you proclaim the word, and you administer the sacraments. You just teach the Bible, and that's the glue that holds everything together. In the kingdom, you've got bakeries and bicycle shops and schools and nurseries and seamstresses and so on. That's out in the kingdom. If you don't want the kingdom to fly apart in tiny little pieces because of acrimony, malice, hostility, and ethnic tension being one of the principal ones, if you don't want that, you have to have a robust form of worship that calls everyone together in Christ and teaches them that in Christ there's neither Jew nor Greek, nor slave nor free, male or female. Come and welcome to Jesus Christ. That has to be the proclamation. So consequently, political communes are all going to crater. They're going to fly apart because people are going to be people. People are going to sin against each other, and there's no way to deal with it apart from forgiveness. And there's no forgiveness apart from the blood of Christ.
So I agree with all of that. The one follow-up I would ask is because, so I've seen you speak very clearly even to your interlocutors on this. I've also seen quite a number of other people doing the same thing. People from Apologia, etc., are also sort of addressing this. I get the macro concept. I guess sort of on the individual concept, there's guys now who are gaining a following, and practically speaking, besides sending them, your book or sending you the stuff that you've written on it, and you've written on this quite a bit lately. There's a lot of communities that are doing that, but people are still getting sucked down these rabbit holes and sort of nursing these grievances. And so, how do you root it out when it's there, when you're doing everything right, but the brainworms are still being unleashed?
Yeah. So I would say number one, I would tell pastors who share the outlook I've just said to be preaching and declaring that's the big picture. Include this sort of thing as part of your pastoral care. In other words, when someone in your community starts popping off on Instagram about the Jews or that sort of thing, an elder or pastor needs to have a talk with them. Let's sit down and work through this in a one-on-one, face-to-face sort of way. And you don't bind people's conscience. If someone says, well, I just think that Israel is not a good idea. Okay, you can continue to think that. But if you give way to malice, or vainglory, or if you go too far down this wormhole, you have to be aware that you are a member of a church that practices church discipline. Okay?
Right.
And if it becomes hateful or spiteful, malicious, or just, out there, at some point, I don't think the issue will be truly clarified until someone is disciplined for this.
Right.
Right. And that becomes a cause célèbre, and it will be, I can't believe you, there'll be some groups that say, I can't believe you did this to that guy. And others who say, finally,
yeah. Or people who don't like you for the other reasons and still can't believe you did it to this guy because they had had bad feelings about you. So I guess the final question here, because I know you've got to go very shortly here, is just looking at the political situation. There's a lot of people who've been putting their eggs in the political basket. The news of just even the last couple of weeks, it's really difficult to know what you're going to find when you turn on the news, right? Who is the president? Is he around?
Who's president today?
Yeah, that sort of thing. And I think what's attractive about, building Christian community is because, you have the long term. How should people engage in politics? Because there's two kinds of people that are attracted to the project that you're working on. There's people who want to just ignore politics and work on these things, and then there's people who see them sort of as an escape hatch to some degree. At the same time, you've written many times, and so have a lot of other social commentators on this issue, that politics unfortunately cares about you, and so what Harris and Walls want to do to the country is going to matter to your community, which is inside the country. So just sort of a final summation answer. How would you suggest that people thread that needle, keep the main thing, and focus on that, while at the same time engaging in politics in a healthy, if possible, way?
Yeah, that's a great question. Again, this is a body life thing, right? I don't believe that every parishioner needs to be politically engaged, up to the eyeballs. A lot of people need to think about other stuff. They need to make a living. They have got business to establish. They've got kids to feed. They've got to have to. And this is why Christian community is so important. I'll put it this way. Suppose I was in the submarine service in the Navy. Suppose it was a sub in World War II, and you went back. You were going back aft, and you came into the cruise mess. You saw the cook there frying eggs, and you said, "What are you doing?" He could answer that two ways. He could say, I'm fighting Hitler, or he could say, I'm frying eggs. And both are true.
Right.
We want him to think about frying the eggs, so the eggs are decent. But he's part of a mechanism where each person is doing their part.
Yeah.
Right. And so this cook has to be good with what the torpedo men are doing. He has to understand his role in the submarine. The torpedo men are doing one thing, he's doing another, but it's all part of the same apparatus, right? And this is Paul's argument in 1 Corinthians, where if the whole body were an eyeball, where would the hearing be? Right. And if the whole body were an ear, if the whole body were a nose, where would the seeing be, and so on. So there's a body life thing where we need to recognize that my elbows are completely blind, right? My elbows can't see a thing, but the eyes see on their behalf. Most of my body is blind, right, as a matter of fact. So when someone comes and joins our church, we don't say, and you've got to sign up to be a precinct committeeman for the Republican Party, or you've got to donate a certain amount of time for a phone bank for the election. They just do what God calls them to do, but they also have to be good with what the torpedo men are doing. Right. So when you come into the community, you don't have to go online and write the way I do, but you have to be okay with being pastored by someone who writes the way I do.
Right.
So everyone has to have the holistic perspective, and this is partly what we mean by fighting as a community, fighting as a culture, and there's a lot of people think that everybody's got to be on the same sheet of music and everybody's got to be checked out on the party platform. That's actually a way to turn your community into an ideological faction, which is going to be fragile, not anti-fragile.
Right.
Communities, cultures are anti-fragile, right?
Yeah.
Cultures can be persecuted by a political leader for centuries and still be tenaciously hanging on. An ideological faction can be arrested and dispersed in a couple of weeks.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, Pastor Wilson, thank you so much for being so generous with your time.
I'll be delighted visiting with you. Thank you for such to-the-point questions.
Absolutely. Thank you for joining us for this conversation. If you want to hear other conversations like it, you can subscribe. You can also find our content wherever you get your podcasts, or you can head over to thebridgehead.ca where we post both written commentary and video. Thanks so much for joining us.